Sup? So, original Xbox emulation has always been a little bit behind when it comes to just overall development and playability of original Xbox games. In fact, Xbox 360 emulation has been far ahead of original Xbox emulation. This can have multiple reasons, but I think the biggest one is that there's just more support and interest in Xbox 360 emulation than there is for the original Xbox. Which is quite a shame, because honestly, the original Xbox has some amazing exclusive games on it that at times you can't even properly play anywhere else other than on the original Xbox. So some titles are not backwards compatible on either the 360 or any other Xbox console, or if they are, they just don't play as well as on the original console. For example, Project Gotham Racing 2 has an absurd amount of crashes if you try to play it on an actual 360, where it is still recommended to play it on an original Xbox console if you have one, which not a lot of people have. And so that's why Xbox emulation was something that I was really looking forward to. But over the last few years, there hasn't really been a whole lot of development on that front. There have been several different Xbox emulators that have been trying to just kind of get more games to be playable. The most promising one so far has been an emulator called Xemu, and I've been kind of going back into that one every couple months to see if any of the updates make any of the games more playable, if there's any changes, and honestly, for the most part, over the last couple years that I've been checking in on it, there hasn't really been a whole lot. At least not to the point where I would say that the emulator is actually viable for playing games now. You can actually play stuff on that emulator. It's something you can kind of like mess around with and experiment, but for the most part, you're still better off playing stuff on an original Xbox, or if available, play something that's backwards compatible on any other Xbox console. However, over the last few weeks, that has changed dramatically. I don't know what has been going on, but there have been a lot of updates on the Xemu emulator that now made a lot of games seemingly completely playable. So I've looked at all of the Xbox exclusive racing games to check how playable they are, and the results have been actually like extremely amazing. So let's check this out. And so here we have the first Forza Motorsport, which has to be the most forgotten entry in the entire series. And obviously it makes sense. This was an OG Xbox exclusive game that I think you can maybe still play. Yeah, you can definitely still play on a 360, but that's kind of it. Now, this has been going through a lot of ups and downs on this emulator. There have actually been updates that made this game less playable over time. But now I think we're at a point where you can absolutely play this game on an emulator if you want to. Now, out of all the games that we're going to look at today, it's probably not the most perfect. You might have some frame dips here and there. In fact, let me actually just enable the frame graph so you can actually like look at the frame rate and the frame time. But yeah, other than that, I gotta be honest, this is a great game. Like, I actually think the first Forza game is absolutely worth playing for its very, very unique content that has never been seen again ever since. So this was obviously the game that was really, where they really tried to compete with Gran Turismo 4, or Gran Turismo in general at its time. And they did a lot of things to really keep up or even exceed Gran Turismo at its time. So, for example, this game, I think out of all the games in the series, by far and wide has the best damage model. The damage model in this game is absolutely fantastic. To the point where I would say it's definitely worth playing for that alone. Like, for example, if I were to like hit a guy, okay, this wasn't like a massive hit. But, you know, if I were to crash, you would probably see it. But also just the career mode in general. Like, the career mode is actually more akin to a classic Gran Turismo career, which I like a lot. And yeah, you can see the game runs perfectly fine. So we are hitting a flat 30 FPS now. Keep in mind, this is Silverstone. This isn't like a crazy track, but it's running at a flat 30. And also keep in mind, this game is upscaled. So we are running at a ×3 resolution scale, or ×4 actually. This is what the game would usually look like. Very pixelated, and it seems to run fine one way or the other, which I think is really cool. So before, whenever I messed with this emulator, I would basically have to be forced to play on the native resolution. This game would not hit any reasonable frame rates on other resolutions other than the native one. But now, and you're gonna see this with every other game that we're gonna look at here, it seems like it doesn't really matter anymore. You can actually just 4x the resolution and it runs the same. And so here's one of the tracks that are unique to the first Forza Motorsport. So you had a Tokyo track in this game that is actually also at night. So don't let the developers fool you, that, or anyone fool you for that matter, that Forza Motorsport 6 was the first game to introduce night racing. It wasn't. The first Forza Motorsport had races at night, and yeah, once again, we're on a 4x resolution scale, so this is basically 1440p. And it looks great, honestly. It's actually crazy how good this game holds up once you actually increase the internal resolution. I think the main problem, other than the car models, are also the liveries. You know, obviously the lettering on it looks fairly pixelated. But other than that, like when it comes to lighting and colors, like this game really looks good. And as you can see, it still runs at a flat 30 FPS. It says 29, but it's 30, trust me. And yeah, it looks great. And this is on a track where a lot more is going on, a lot more lighting, there's a lot more track detail. We are alone on this track, but I think if we had opponents here, I don't think this would change anything really. But obviously you're gonna still be stuck to 30 FPS, and you're gonna see this more often with a lot of these original Xbox games that they run at 30 FPS. Now I know 30 FPS isn't particularly great, especially these days. 60 FPS would definitely much improve this game even further. The thing is, I don't think we're gonna see any 60 FPS patches for this emulator anytime soon. This emulator is still very much in its early development stage, I would say. Some stuff like 60 FPS patches like we've seen for maybe the PS2 emulator, for example, or even the PS3 emulator, that's kind of like an extra thing that the community works on. And I don't see there being any support for this anytime soon. However, there is a way to still play this game at 60 FPS, but it does come with some caveats. If you are aware, there is a program called Lossless Scaling, and this one basically allows any windowed application, so you can also use this for videos or whatever if you want to basically have frame generation. And so you can generate frames to push this game and also any other game to twice the frame rate, which in this case would mean 60 FPS. So if I were to enable this, you can see that the game now runs a lot smoother. So I have to do a bit of an intermission here as I'm editing the video. So for some reason, whenever I enabled frame generation with lossless scaling, you couldn't actually see any of that on the recording. Like the recording still show the basic 30 FPS base frame rate. So all of that I talk about with how much smoother the video looks and whatnot, you just gotta take my word for it. I don't know why it's not showing up in the video. Maybe some of you guys can explain it to me in the comments, but yeah, just trust me, bro. It still says 30 on the video debug because the game obviously thinks it is running in 30 FPS, and like under the hood it definitely is, because we're just generating frames. And the thing with frame generation, it's very controversial because on one hand, you're gonna have the issue of artifacting, like the motion might not look as good. Like you're gonna have, if you look really closely, you're gonna see some, you might see some artifacts with frame generation. And also the other thing is that it's input latency, because the way it works in simple terms is that the frames basically get delayed so that the program can generate a frame in between, which basically means you're gonna get an added input latency with this game. Or with any game that you use this on. Which, especially for racing games, might be a bit of a deal breaker. I think racing games is like one of the games where you ideally do not want to have any input delay. It really depends on the game. I think when it's stuff like a simulator or a rally game where you have to like react quickly, this stuff is a little bit more difficult. However, I think in a lot of racing games, they already come with a lot of input delay added in. And I think to a certain degree, it is kind of like a reasonable delay between the steering wheel and the car moving. It really depends on the case. It also heavily depends on the monitor that you're using, how much added latency comes from the display itself. So for example, me, I'm using an OLED monitor, so I have no added input latency. So yeah, it does definitely make the game look a lot smoother, a lot better at 60 FPS, that's for sure. When it comes to playing, for me, it's okay. Once again, it's really a game-by-game basis. How good this actually works and how okay this feels. I think with Forza Motorsport, I am okay with it, but I can also see some other people might not be okay with it. It's something that I think I would really encourage you to try for yourself. The program only costs like a couple bucks on Steam, and if you find out you don't like it at all, you can just refund it. And so here we are on the Nurburgring. So if you didn't know, the first Forza Motorsport also had the Nordschleife as a track. Now it looks absolutely cursed in this game, to say the very least. This is probably one of the most cursed iterations of the Nordschleife. You can see how weird it just kind of looks, and it almost doesn't look like the Nordschleife at all. But yeah, we're still running frame generation. I also decided to put myself into a faster car this time around to really like push the limits, and honestly, I think it's fine. I think in Forza Motorsport, it is okay to use frame generation. I feel like all of the Forza Motorsports, especially the later ones, the cars generally feel fairly heavy in those games and not as twitchy or responsive. So this honestly doesn't feel that much different than any other Forza Motorsport, if I'm being honest. I think this is definitely like the one game where I would say it's okay to use frame generation, especially considering we're running 30 FPS, so usually frame generation isn't really recommended for, or to basically increase the frame rate from 30 to 60, because usually it comes with a lot of artifacting. Like usually you want a fairly high base frame rate, ideally 60 FPS, and push it to way higher frame rates that your monitor supports. However, honestly, like I think in this case, it's actually fine. Like, it looks noticeably smoother. Something looks off about it. It's hard to put it into words. But as far as I can tell, there is no obvious artifacting. Like, even if I move the camera around a little bit here, I don't notice any artifacting. Like, maybe if you really go frame by frame on the video, and like you zoom in on certain objects, you might be able to tell some. But honestly, in motion, this just looks really good. It looks really good. Once again, there is some input lag. It definitely feels more direct if you do not use it. However, I think in this instance I would be okay with it and just take the smooth motion. I think it does add a lot to the experience, and the fact that this works surprisingly well with not a whole lot of artifacting is very surprising. So yeah, Forza Motorsport honestly seems very playable. Once again, you can also use frame generation if you want to. One thing that I can't really comment on when it comes to this emulator is how stable any of this is. So there's a good chance that these games might crash at certain points, or you might not be able to proceed. That's something I'm not able to test with every single game. However, just playing through some of the races and time trials, it seems like the game runs fairly stable. So if you wanted to ever play the first Forza Motorsport, I think now is a good time to play it on the emulator. Once again, the emulator is called Xemu. And yeah, I think overall you're probably gonna have a great experience. Once again, the game looks great, honestly, especially once you upscale it. It seems to really adapt fairly well to higher resolutions. Frame generation, it also seems to adapt pretty well to it, so you can push 60 FPS if you want to. Overall, big win for Forza Motorsport, so let's check out the next game. Now, obviously, you can't go talking about Xbox original exclusive racing games without talking about Project Gotham Racing. And Project Gotham Racing 1 and 2 are very particular cases because these games, as far as I know, are only backwards compatible on the 360. And on those consoles, these games look or run pretty badly. Especially Project Gotham Racing 2, which we'll also get to later, crashes constantly. So this is going to be really interesting, especially because the first game runs at 60 FPS, but the second game runs at 30 FPS. And as you can see, this also runs well. There might be some hitches with this one in particular, but so far so good. Like, once again, this seems to work surprisingly well. I'm not sure what event I just got into, some kind of cone challenge. And yeah, this is definitely a game that seems to also run pretty well at 60 FPS. Which is very surprising. As I said, there might be some hitches if you hit cars, if you do certain things. You might still run into big frame rate drops. But the huge thing with this is that this runs smoothly at 60 without frame generation. You can obviously use frame generation for this and then push to 120. And once again, this is probably how you're supposed to use frame generation. However, I honestly think like this already looks and feels very, very smooth at just 60. This is where I would say that like pushing this to 120 in this case is definitely more of a luxury and a bonus that's not really necessary. And I think you're gonna start to see fairly diminishing returns with the input lag, because the jump from 30 FPS to 60 is a lot bigger than the jump from 60 to 120. Although it sounds like it's more frames, but for your eye it looks a lot better going from 30 to 60. So honestly, with this game, I would say just running it at the base frame rate is okay. It seems to run stable for most parts, other than like the occasional hitches. And visually also looks fine. I think it doesn't look as good as Forza Motorsport. I think with this game the problem is that the anisotropic filtering, like if you look at the road ahead, you can kind of see that it's very blurry in the distance, and it just kind of starts to sharpen up as you get closer, which looks a little bad. And also there is some issues with the shadows. You will probably notice this later if I... Okay, he's just running over all the cones, okay. Some of the shadows do flicker, which might be a little bit distracting. I don't think it's the end of the world, but yeah, I can see some people getting annoyed by this. And so here we are in a race, and you can tell that, yeah, especially with cars on the roads, the frame rate starts to take a little bit of a dip, especially because the game doesn't just lag, it also slows down, which is a bit of a problem. Now, I'm not sure why this could be. We could try to reduce the internal resolution, see if that fixes it. So now we're back on normal. Not really. So the game still slows down regardless of whether or not you increase the internal resolution. We could try to use a different renderer. So let's switch to OpenGL, see if that fixes anything. That does seem to fix it. Okay, so I think for this game, you want to use the OpenGL renderer. That just seems to fix all of the lags. Okay, cool. Right, so this is another thing that you have to just kind of pay attention to if the game for whatever reason seems to lag or slow down. Try switching the renderer, try reducing the internal resolution. That usually fixes stuff, and I'll try to do as much research for this video. So Forza Motorsport, which we looked at earlier, was running on the Vulkan renderer, so I think you can just use the Vulkan renderer there and it's gonna be fine. However, for Project Gotham Racing, I think, as we can clearly see, the OpenGL renderer is the one that runs better. So make sure to use that one if you want to use the, if you want to play this game at a high frame rate. But yeah, I mean, other than that, it looks great. I don't actually notice any shadow flickering now either, so maybe that got fixed. Now we still have some flickering shadows here. Okay, so that's like the only visual issue that seems to still persist with this. But once again, like, I don't think it's an issue that's bad enough that it warrants not playing the game at all. I think it's definitely good because, like, you know, it's kind of like a trade-off. You have flickering shadows, but you know, on the positive side, you can actually increase the internal resolution. The game looks much higher res, a lot sharper. And you get to play it on PC, which is just more convenient. You get to use whatever controller you want, honestly. I think the positives kind of outweigh the negatives there. And yeah, once again, when it comes to frame generation, you can use it. I don't think it's necessary. I think the game runs well enough as is at 60. So yeah, seems to be a win for Project Gotham Racing 1. So let's go to the sequel. And so here we have Project Gotham Racing 2. Now, the game runs at 60 FPS in the menus, so don't get confused. But as soon as you actually get into the game, you'll find out that, yeah, the rest of the game runs at 30, unfortunately. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem to run all that well either. So we're still on the OpenGL renderer. We're hitting 10 FPS, which means that we are at a third of the game speed, which is obviously not good. Now we can try to now switch to... Oh, actually, never mind. We were still on the Vulkan renderer, so let's switch to OpenGL. That's what kind of improved performance on Project Gotham Racing 1. And it seems like we're definitely hitting higher frame rates, but not quite high enough. So, yeah, the game is definitely running a little bit better, but now we're only at half speed now, but it's still not particularly great. So let's try to actually go back to the native resolution. And now we're hitting around 20 FPS, so yeah, I don't know. I don't think this is a game where you really want to play this on an emulator just yet. Like, you're still gonna hit sub 20 here, unfortunately. This obviously is quite unfortunate because, according to many people, this is the best Project Gotham Racing game. So it would have been nice to actually be able to check this out on an emulator, but at this performance, I don't know. So you can definitely still hit 30 FPS in certain areas if you get behind, get past all the opponents. And there's not a whole lot of stuff in front of you, then this might be fine. But yeah, to call this enjoyable, I don't know. Playable, maybe. But enjoyable, not really. I think this is definitely like a game that I think still needs a little bit more optimization. That's for sure. Gotta give it a no for me, which is quite a shame because this game does look really, really fun and substantially better than the first game. But yeah, as you can see, like, we're definitely hitting sub 20 once again as we look more towards the rest of the track. So yeah, definitely give this one a bit more time in the oven, and hopefully we get to see more improvements on this one down the line as we did with the other games. So yeah, let's switch gears and check out something different. And so here we have Sega GT Online, which is exactly the same game as Sega GT 2002, just with extra content added. There's no reason to play Sega GT 2002 if you can play this. And this is a game that also runs at 60 FPS, which is quite nice. And it seems to run pretty darn well. So let me check again what renderer we're on. We are on the Vulkan renderer, once again at 4x resolution. The game looks great and seems to run just as well. So we are actually in a replay. Those are usually a little bit more performance intensive, obviously, because they usually crank up the graphics a bunch for these, and it seems to run pretty well. But let's obviously check out the gameplay as well. So I don't know much about this game because this is one that I've genuinely never played. I did play the first Sega GT game. There's a playthrough on it on my channel, and I gotta say it was okay. It had some fairly interesting ideas, I would say, but like as a game, it was kind of meh. So this is definitely a game that I was really looking forward to playing eventually, once this actually became playable on Xbox emulator. And yeah, looks like we're here. This seems to run unbelievably stable. And I gotta say this game looks also once again fantastic. It also seems to have a really great car list. I was kind of having a small scroll through earlier, and we're in some kind of like racing RX3, which I can't say I've ever seen before. But yeah, it seems to run great. Once again, flat 60 FPS. As I said earlier, I can't talk about stability. I don't know if these games crash just yet or not. There's a very real possibility that most of these games will just crash the longer you play them. And yeah, it runs super smooth. So once again, since we are at a 60 FPS, pretty much, I don't see any like major hitches here either actually. You can use frame generation to push it up to 120. However, I think I will say on this game, I don't recommend it because the cars already feel very heavy. They react somewhat slow, not slowly to inputs, but they feel very weighty, and that weighty feeling gets exaggerated a lot once you enable frame generation. So in Forza, which we looked at earlier, although we went from 30 to 60, which does introduce more input lag, it felt more okay because the cars were very maneuverable. Whereas here they feel very, very, as I said, like very heavy, very grounded, and I think once you start to add, you know, input latency in the through frame generation, this feeling only gets worse. So you can play it at 120. It's possible, but I don't think I would recommend it for this game because I just don't think the handling really lends itself very well to it. RallySport Challenge 2 is also another Xbox exclusive title, and as far as I know, this game is not even backwards compatible on any of the other Xbox consoles. So you either had to have an original Xbox for this or wait for emulation. And since emulation has gone a lot better, let's see how this turns out. And so here we are not quite hitting 60 FPS all the time. At least we weren't in the beginning. Yeah, we're definitely still seeing some hitches here and there. So once again, we are on the Vulkan renderer at 4x resolution. Jesus Christ, why did I have to get into such a beast of a car? So yeah, I'm not sure with this one just yet. The problem is, since it is a rally game, I imagine this is like the one game where you absolutely need a stable frame rate, because these games are very fast. They require very precise movements, fast reactions, all that kind of stuff. Now it seems like we're doing pretty okay. Maybe it was just the initial area. There's definitely some funky stuff going on with the LODs in the background and the distance scaling. So there's some flickering going on. But now it seems like we're fairly stable. Maybe it was really just the initial area. This is a game that I was kind of like semi-interested in. I actually really enjoy rally games. But there's just so many that feel fairly similar to me. This one does feel somewhat different compared to the others. It feels a little bit more arcadey, more along the lines of like a Sega rally racing game. And the first game was a cross-platform title as far as I understand. So the first game you could also just play on PC or use a different emulator for it if you want to. But this one was definitely an Xbox exclusive title. And I gotta be honest, this game looks absolutely amazing once you actually upscale this. I think this might genuinely be the best looking game we've seen so far, other than obviously like the distance scaling being a little bit messed up. But I don't think that's from the game. I think it might still be some emulator shenanigans, yeah, playing a role there. But yeah, it's mostly stable. I think once you get into some of the more denser areas, like I think once we were driving through some of the cities here, that's where the frame rate started to take a bit of a dip. But, yeah, once again, also here. Basically, I think once there's just... Oh god, Jesus Christ. Once there's too much geometry on the screen, I think that's when the emulation starts to kind of take a bit of a dip. If that doesn't bother you, it seems like most of these areas are fairly straightforward anyways. So this one I think is a bit of a mixed recommendation. It's definitely one of those things where I would encourage you to just kind of try it out, play through the game, see how it performs on different tracks. I think this might also be another case where the emulation performs better on some tracks than on others. But it's more of a mixed recommendation when it comes to this game. For the most part, it runs stable, but in some areas, you're definitely going to start to see hitches, so... Yeah, I don't know. And also, you know, since I talked about frame generation earlier, I think in this instance I would once again not recommend it, although the handling is very responsive, just for this reason that this is a rally game. You need to react quickly, you need to just kind of make fine adjustments, so having any kind of input lag there is not really the play. Last but certainly not least, we have Midtown Madness 3, which, like, that's a series I gotta be honest, I have not touched at all. I have not played any of the Midtown Madness games, but Midtown Madness 3 was actually an Xbox exclusive, made by a different team, in fact. So this, I assume, plays very different compared to the other games, but yeah, let's see how it performs. Okay, so yeah, this is kind of how emulation looked like before. Before all of the updates that made a lot more games playable. This is kind of playable. This is kind of the experience you were signing up for before. In fact, before you also had major issues with the audio. All of the audio sounds fine, I would say, or at least most of it sounds fine to me. This was like one major issue with the emulator previously, and it seems to have mostly been fixed. But yeah, with this game, unfortunately, we can see some pretty abundant visual glitches. I think what fixes this is the resolution scaling. So if we set this to ×1, yeah, there we go. So at ×1, you get rid of all the weird lines and the game looks normal again. Obviously, the way to go, at least for now, if you want to play this. However, I gotta be honest, other than that, it seems to run pretty well. I don't see any noticeable drops in frame rate or anything of that sort, which is impressive because there's a lot going on here. So you have a world that seems very, very detailed with a lot of destructibles. There's a lot of traffic, there's pedestrians. Like, there's actually a ton going on here at any given time. So to have all of that run at a stable, albeit 30 FPS, is pretty impressive. Now, once again, you can enable frame generation with this, so I'm gonna turn this on now. And I gotta be honest, I don't notice... the input lag is actually super fine with this. I think this is a game where I would actually highly recommend use frame generation. Once again, like, it doesn't seem like there's any major artifacting. I don't notice anything that looks really bizarre. And this game has very, very direct, twitchy handling, which obviously gets delayed a little bit. However, I think for this kind of game, it might be fine. Once again, with frame generation, I would always encourage you to just try it out yourself, see what you think and how you feel about it. However, I think in this instance, once again, this is a game where I would actually recommend to push it from 30 to 60. It's really not that terrible, and my experience with frame generation has been like, sure, there is input lag. It varies on what kind of game you're playing and what the base frame rate is. But generally, when it comes to input lag, it's fairly easy to get used to. You also got to consider that for the most part, most people always play with input lag. Think about all the people that play with Bluetooth controllers. Those come with input lag. Like, the Bluetooth connection adds a considerable amount of input delay, in fact. And so frame generation doesn't necessarily make it that much worse if you are using a wired controller, and if you have a monitor that has little or maybe even no added latency, it's actually not that bad. It's something you can really, really easily get used to. However, despite everything, you know, everyone has very different sensibilities when it comes to this stuff. But honestly, in this game, I would probably recommend it. I would recommend you to try this out. It looks a lot smoother. It feels a lot smoother. And the input lag is actually... It doesn't feel as bad. I feel like other games that I played earlier with no frame generation felt like had more input lag, more noticeable input lag without it than this game with it enabled. So... I would say this is fine. Like, I think this is a game where you could use it just like with Forza Motorsport. And so those were all of the major Xbox exclusive racing games. And I gotta be honest, I am absolutely amazed with the progress that has been made. It seemed like just a couple months ago, we were never gonna see any updates to this. All of the games had some major issues, whether that be performance or visuals or sound. I think pretty much all the games had major sound issues that made them completely unplayable. But now I think we're at a point where you can genuinely go ahead, assuming these are all stable, and play the first Forza Motorsport. Play the earlier Project Gotham Racing. Okay, oh, actually only the first one. As I said, like, there are still some issues. You're gonna see some hitches in the frame rate here and there. And some games might not be playable at all. Like, for example, Project Gotham Racing 2, performance-wise, is just not up to snuff just now. Or in cases like, for example, Midtown Madness 3, which you have to still play at the basic native resolution, which doesn't look as great on modern monitors. But overall, I would say this is great. You can absolutely now go ahead and use this emulator to just play stuff, which I would not be saying before, like a couple months ago. This emulator, I think, has a lot of ways to go still, for sure. But I think over time, if we just give it more time at this point, this is going to become a great emulator down the line. And it has really cemented itself as the de facto OG Xbox emulator at this point, I think. So yeah, let me know if there are any games you want to play on this emulator on the original Xbox, and also let me know if you want to see a setup tutorial to this emulator, because this emulator is not actually as easy to set up, and getting the games to run requires a little bit of extra work. So if you want to see any kind of tutorial on how to set up this emulator and how to get the games to run on it, let me know in the comments below. And yeah, that's about it for today, guys. Thanks so much for hanging out, appreciate it. And until next time, take care, take it easy, and as always, peace. See you guys.